charcoal fire. Peter saw it immediately, as soon as he had come on shore. Peter had been out fishing all night, because after Jesus had died, and then they'd seen him in the upper room. Well, then Jesus wasn't there any longer, and Peter didn't know what to do. His life had lost its meaning. I mean, after all, he had denied Jesus. He had turned away from him at the moment when things mattered most. So rather than going forward, forging ahead, he retreated back to what he knew. And so he went out fishing. And after a night of fishing, they had come up empty, he and the other disciples. They didn't have anything to show for it. But then they heard this man on shore. They saw him in the distance. They saw the man, and he said, "Go and cast the nets out on the other side." And this rang familiar to them. This had happened before. It was one of those flashbacks. And so they went out, and they cast the net on the other side, and suddenly they were hoisting up fish upon fish, just nets full. The nets were breaking, and suddenly it was like, oh yeah, I know when this had happened before. And they looked on shore, and they realized it was Jesus. And so Peter dove in excitedly, because Peter was that kind of a guy, that kind of a headstrong, I'm not going to wait to get in, I'm going to go see him immediately. I'm pretty sure the guys in the boat may not have been as happy about that, because the process of bringing in a boat is a little bit more challenging, and Peter wasn't there to help them, but Peter just dove in. He saw Jesus, and he knew it was the Lord. He wanted to be with him. But then, as he's getting on shore, he sees where Jesus is. He sees what he's standing by. Charcoal fire. Immediately, Peter's mind goes back. It goes back to another charcoal fire. As a matter of fact, in all of Scripture, the words charcoal fire are only used 2 times. And the other time is just a couple of chapters.
Now what does he do? Daddy.
Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since the disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside the gate. So the other disciple, who knew the high priest, went out and spoke to the woman who guarded the gate and brought Peter in. And the woman said to Peter, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire, because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. And Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. The charcoal fire was the scene of the crime. The scene of the place where Peter, bold, brash Peter, I'm going to stand up and go with you. It was his Waterloo. The place where he failed miserably, with all expectations, all hopes. It's where, rather than standing up and dying with Jesus, he retreated and warmed himself in the cold. It was the place where his greatest failure occurred. And he comes on shore, and there's Jesus with a charcoal fire, which is not something you would have on a beach. Jesus had made it deliberately, intentionally. And so they eat, and I can just imagine Peter the whole time squirming, going, there's a reason for this. And after the meal, Jesus pulls Peter aside, and Peter's ready. He's ready to hear, who do you think you are? You let me down. You didn't stand up for me. He's ready to hear that he was a failure and he didn't deserve to be by Jesus. But no, what does Jesus do? Jesus asks him, do you love me? Not what? the charcoal fire. He is forced to see where he failed, and then granted grace and forgiveness as Jesus empowers him and tells him, not your fire, but rather, follow me. Don't go back to what you were. Remember, I told you you were to be a fisher of people. Go forward. Claim this and move through your failure. Become better. Become stronger. And just a mere few days later, Peter is up on Pentecost Sunday proclaiming the gospel and risking his life. He's been empowered by Jesus to do and to be who God calls him to be and what God has called him to do. And that message comes to each and every one of us in the charcoal fires of our lives. Because we all have them, don't we? We all have those places where we failed, where we fell short. Maybe you heard a racist or an Islamophobic or a sexist joke, and you chuckled quietly, rather than boldly standing up and saying, that's wrong. That's not how it's supposed to be. Maybe you uttered idle gossip. It seemed harmless, but you knew it was harmful. Or you found out it wasn't true. Maybe there was a time of family division and your own emotions took you down a road that you would rather not have followed. We all have those charcoal fires where we sinned against God in thought, word, and deed by what we have done and by what we have left undone. We all have those moments that we think, oh, if I could only have that back. If I could only remember my call and be who I am. And here's the neat thing about Jesus. He doesn't ignore them. He doesn't push them down. I don't believe if he had not made Peter face that charcoal fire, Peter could have been who he was, because he would have always pushed it down with shame. He would have always pushed down the fact, he's thinking, I'm a pretender. I'm posing. This isn't who I am. If people only knew, if Jesus only really knew. But that's not what happened. Jesus lanced the wound by addressing it and then saying, I know you're not perfect, but I'm going to use you anyway. I know you don't have it all together, but you don't have to. Jesus does not call the equipped. He equips the called, and that's what he did for Peter. That's what he did for Peter by saying to him and by bringing him to the charcoal fire and saying, feed my lambs, and letting him get off his chest 3 times to replace the 3 denials. In our lives, we can't ignore those places of shame because they will just continue to eke out like an infection spreading in our bodies. Just spreading out the shame because we know we didn't do the right thing. No, instead we need to bring them to Jesus. We need to acknowledge them. We need to lance the wound and let it get into the air and cleanse it. Sometimes that means acknowledging it to others. That's actually the wonderful thing about private confession. As a church, we do public confession, but sometimes private confession and saying to somebody, I did something wrong, frees you of shame. I know in my own life when I've gone to someone and confessed a sin, I felt freer because then I no longer feel like I'm posing. I no longer feel like I have to have it all together. And in our own lives, we can do that. We can acknowledge it. We can say it. And if you do it to a pastor or to another Christian, you're not going to say, oh, that's nothing. Or they're not going to say, that's unforgivable. Instead, the words that will come out is, by grace you have been forgiven. Cleansing the womb. And then allowing you to go back and be effective in ministry. The powers and forces of evil have more focus on the negative effects of shame by keeping us from being involved because somehow we think we aren't worthy. And the joy and the grace of forgiveness is it tells us you don't have to be worthy. You just have to follow Jesus. So whatever those charcoal fires are in your life, wherever those places are where you feel that you've failed, wherever there's a bit of shame, don't ignore it. Name it to yourself, and if you need to, name it to another. And then hear the words that Jesus said to Peter that he also says to you. Do you love me?